Okay, everyone, we're ready to go. Good evening, everybody. My name is Norman Goda. I am the director for the Center of Jewish Studies at the University of Florida, and I am delighted to welcome you to our kickoff event for the 2020-2021 academic year. In 2004, the prolific Jewish American novelist Philip Roth published The Plot Against America, a novel containing an alternate history by which isolationist Charles A. Lindbergh defeats Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the election of 1940. The US does not enter World War II. The US comes to a rapprochement with Hitler's Germany, and latent anti-Semitism in the United States comes to the surface. In 2020, the producer David Simon adapted the novel for a 6-part series on HBO. One reviewer for the Times of Israel wrote, "I cover anti-Semitism. The Plot Against America is the scariest show I have seen." And only days ago, the New York Times noted that The Plot Against America was also a cautionary tale for the 2020 presidential election. Democracy, the newspaper says, is merely a choice, not an inevitability. I want to start by playing, if I can, the trailer for The Plot Against America on HBO, knowing that not everyone has seen it. This will only take a couple of minutes.
My intention in running for the presidency is preventing America from taking part in another world war. Your choice is not between Charles A. Lindbergh and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It is between Lindbergh and war.
What if Lindbergh does win?
Everyone sees what he is.
To most people in this country, there's never been a bigger hero in their lifetime.
The Jewish people and the Roosevelt administration.
Yes? Let's call him his war agitators. Listen to that crowd.
There are so many who don't trust him.
And I'm gonna do my best to convince them otherwise.
There's a lot of hate out there, and he knows how to tap into it.
Admittedly, Mr. Lindbergh made statements grounded in anti-Semitic cliche, but it did so out of ignorance.
Now, this is how it starts. Since everywhere he goes, Hitler beats down and shoots the Jews. There may be a time when he comes here, to America, to beat down and shoot us. What will our president do then?
We always think we're Americans. Maybe it's too early to leave, but it's not too early to have a backup plan.
I'm tired of turning my cheek.
Lindbergh is a hero.
This is not an evil man, not in any way. Tell me, does that begin to address your fears?
I am very pleased right now to introduce our distinguished panel, and we are going to go around the table and give everyone about 6 minutes to answer a few questions from me, and then we will throw it open for general questions. If you have a question, please send it through chat. Tell us who the question is for or whether the question is for the entire panel, and then type your question out. But I am pleased to introduce our panel at this time. Jack Kugelmass is an anthropologist at the University of Florida whose focus is on Jewish ethnography and culture. He also works on the Holocaust, Jewish film, and Jewish travel literature. His books include From a Ruined Garden, the memorial books of Polish Jewry, Jews, Sports, and the Rights of Citizenship, and he is currently completing Traveling in Yiddish, an examination of Yiddish travel books, 1918 to 1964. Brett Ashley Kaplan teaches Jewish American and Holocaust literature at the University of Illinois, where she is the Conrad Humanities Scholar in the Comparative and World Literature program, and also the director of the Initiative in Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies. She is a specialist in the problem of Holocaust representation. Her books include Unwanted Beauty, Aesthetic Pleasure, and Holocaust Representation, Landscapes of Holocaust Post-Memory, and especially interesting for our purposes tonight, Jewish Anxiety in the Novels of Philip Roth. Gavriel D. Rosenfeld is a professor of history at Fairfield University, where he teaches courses on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. He is especially interested in counterfactual history. His books include The World Hitler Never Made, Alternate History and the Memory of Nazism, What Ifs of Jewish History from Abraham to Zionism, and most recently, The Fourth Reich, The Specter of Nazism from World War II to the Present. And Rachel Gordon is the Samuel Shorstein Professor in American Jewish Culture at the University of Florida. She teaches courses on Jewish culture in the US during the 20th century. She is currently finishing a book project about post-World War II American Jewish culture called How Judaism Became an American Religion. She is also completing another book about the anti-Semitic novel turned classic feature film, Gentleman's Agreement. Welcome, everybody. I am most pleased that you can be here. And again, I'd like to take 5 or 6 minutes with each of you, if I may, and then we can throw it open to a more general discussion. Jack Kugelnuss, I'd like to begin with you. Can you provide a very brief synopsis of The Plot Against America, and what do you think are the fundamental differences between the 2004 book and the 2020 HBO series?
Well, to begin with, I think the title of the Plot Against America is a misnomer, since there's no real plot against America. There was really perhaps the idea of America. There's a plot against that, but the real plot is the plot against Jews, and that's what really the story of the novel's about and the television series. The underlying theme of this is citizenship. It's about Jewish belonging or not belonging, and whether or not America's Jews should move to Palestine, which is part of the opening vignette of the series and of the novel, and more realistically to Canada, which figures throughout the narrative as a refuge from an America gone bad. The plot focuses on an extended middle-class Jewish family, the Levins, who live in the Jewish section of Newark. They were aspiring to buy a more substantial home elsewhere. The Levins' lives change drastically when Roosevelt loses his bid for a third term to Charles Lindbergh, who campaigned on a vacuous platform with only 2 elements. We saw them in the little snippet of what they are. And that latter, that sort of staying out of the war, made him the darling of the Nazis. So whether or not he was pro-Hitler, his cabinet included people who despised Jews, including Henry Ford. And Lindbergh's government devised a plan to de-Judaize America's Jews by moving them away from large clusters in large urban areas to the heartland of America. And that's really one of the key elements that takes place within the story. Most Jews are horrified by the prospect, but one of the Levin families, the wife in the Levin family, Bess, her sister falls in love with Rabbi Bengelsdorf, a rabbi originally from the South and of German Jewish background, who is a pro-Lindbergh person and really spearheads this idea of moving Jews into the countryside, into the heartland rather. And he appoints Evelyn, the sister, to run the program in Newark. And she runs this program called Just Folks to send kids to live in the country for this summer. That's basically what goes on. I would say that the most important chapter in the book, from my standpoint, is when the family goes on vacation to Washington, D.C. Because there, the issue of citizenship is writ large. They visit the nation's great patriotic monuments, especially the Lincoln Memorial, where Herman, the father of the family, reads the words inscribed out loud and laments the defeat of a great President Roosevelt, and passing tourists disparage him as just a loudmouth Jew. And the key scene is finding themselves expelled from the hotel because of a supposed prior booking. And here it seems to be a direct quote from a gentleman's agreement, where the hotel simply says, "We have no room for you." There's a sympathetic response from a couple of people they encounter, including a tour guide. And it sets up the complexity of America as anti-Semitic, not anti-Semitic. So these two elements appear there. The series beautifully visualizes the receptions Lindbergh threw for the German foreign minister, von Ribbentrop. In the story, Herman, the father of the family, his nephew, goes to Montreal to enlist in the Canadian Armed Forces. He works in the new technology, and goes into battle and is wounded and loses a leg. He comes back, I don't know. I mean, I have to bring this to a close as quickly as possible, and not go on too long. But towards the end of the story, the first lady, the wounded Alvin, the nephew, is recruited by some agents, some British and Canadian agents, to use the new technology he worked with to help bring down the president's plane, which apparently they succeed in doing. And there's riots that take place in America, and riots against Jews, against Jewish stores. And the first lady is in fact arrested by a group within the government. And along with her, Rabbi Bengelsdorf, who would become her confidant. Eventually they're released, and she announced that there'll be a new election and everything will go back to normal. Just some thoughts about the whole story. It's, as I said, citizenship runs very, very large within this story. Complexity of citizenship and the Jewish unease about whether or not they are citizens of this country will continue to be. And there's this very strong leitmotif of phallocentricity. That includes the fact that Alvin, the nephew, gets his leg blown off, and his manhood is restored when he's able to help bring down the president's plane. It's a very phallic device that's used to do this. There's more I could say about that, including when Herman has to go to Kentucky to pick up a neighbor's son who is there after the riots, and he gets a gun from a neighbor and gives him a certain amount of protection. The striking feature of Roth's storytelling is the use of twinning. Everywhere there's two sons, the two brothers, the Bess and Evelyn's, the two sisters who are completely different from each other, Herman and Alvin, Roosevelt and Lindbergh, Bengelsdorf and Walter Winchell, the bad ethnics, the bad Germans, and the good ethnics, the Italians, Newark and Kentucky, USA and Canada, Ottawa and DC, Mrs. Lindbergh and Charles Lindbergh. And you can go on and on and on of this technique that Roth used to storytell, which I find quite fascinating. The principal difference between the series and the book is that the series is more affective, it's more emotional, and of course spectacular. It's just the nature of film or TV. And that really shows up in the von Ribbentrop reception, which is quite something. The wedding of the rabbi and Evelyn, and the visit to DC with viewing the monuments to the civic religion. The book is more cerebral, and of course, what the series cannot display is Roth's fine craftsmanship as a writer, his sarcasm, and the way that he constructs and deconstructs character. You asked me, is this a Holocaust film? And the answer is absolutely. For a film to be a Holocaust film, you don't need dead Jews, but you do need live Nazis. And certainly they're here within this. And it's as much a Holocaust film as The Great Dictator, or For Me and the Colonel.
Thank you, Jack. I want to move on to you now, Brett Kaplan. Philip Roth, who died 2.5 years ago, or a year and a half ago, has a very large corpus of novels, more than 25. And Plot Against America was written on at least we can say the back end of his career. You've noted Roth's interest in the Holocaust, but also his fascination with America. And you've written that for Roth, there is, and I quote you, a traumatic hidden truth behind the mask of the American dream, unquote. So how then ought we situate the Plot Against America within the corpus of Roth's work, so particularly concerning things like Jewish anxieties?
Okay, great, thanks. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you so much, Norm, for this lovely invitation, and thank you Jewish Studies at University of Florida, and thank you Jack for situating the novel, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Gav and Rachel have to say. Rachel, I'm glad you're back. You disappeared for a little minute there, but it's great to have you back. So to answer your question about situating Plot Against America in terms of Roth's other works, I would say this book is actually quite distinct from his other novels. It's not the first novel to use someone named Philip Roth as the main character, and it's certainly not the first novel to involve lots of research. I'm thinking about the lengthy, long sections around the glove factory in American Pastoral, or all the research Roth will have done into the history of boxing for Human Stain. It's also not the only counterfactual novel, and Gab will talk more about counterfactuals later. But it's also weirdly, I think, given the disturbing subject matter, it's cornier, I would say, than a lot of his other works. It's lacking that acerbic comedy and irony that so characterized novels like Portnoy's Complaint, Sabbath's Theater, and Operation Shylock. It's also weirdly, given how unreal so much of the novel is, one of his most loving portraits of his parents, right? He does write a lot about his parents in some of his other works, but here we have a Bess who is so incredibly strong, and she's at the center of this topsy-turvy universe, and yet she's really the glue who keeps it all together for the sake of her children. She's very, very intensely proud of her kids, and she really is the sort of emotional centerpiece for everyone. Everyone relies on her. So I thought that that's interesting in the way in which it's this totally, in a sense, unreal counterfactual world, and yet here we have, you know, his real family. In the novel, all of the names are the actual names of his family, and Rachel, you brought us to an article that describes why it is that they were changed for the HBO series, but apparently Roth didn't want it to be as autobiographical as it might seem when it got to the screen as it is on the page, as it were. So it's also the only Roth novel that's narrated through the focalization of a child. The narrator is an adult, Philip Roth, looking back on the pre-war years, but it's through the child's perspective. Oh boy, we have a major thunderstorm here. I hope you can hear me over the thunder.
We can hear you.
Okay, good. And I think that the series actually handles that perspective through the child really well. There's all of those close-ups of the little Philip, you know, reacting as the adults go through all of these zany gymnastics. So for all of the ways in which it seems like it might be really far-fetched for us to have a fascist president, I just want to show you, oops, sorry, I'm sharing the wrong thing. I just want to show you a couple of images. Can you see those now? Everybody see those? Okay. So this is, of course, Charles Lindbergh here, and this is Hermann Goring. And so while we never had von Ribbentrop in the White House, as we have in the HBO series, we do have these American heroes historically receiving this is a Luftwaffe sword from Goring. And I just wanted to show you a couple more images. This is one from the very end of the series, and you can see it says "Death to Jews." This is a little shop in Wequahic, which has been devastated at towards the end of the series. And I just wanted to show you how closely Simon or the researchers at HBO are hewing to what a shop that was graffitied would have looked like. So this is from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum archival collection. And it's, you know, you've seen these images before, and I think it's quite incredible to see the graffiti rendered in English as opposed to what we're all used to, which is to see it rendered, of course, in German. And this is also an image from the very end of the series. And Jack, you said definitively that this is a Holocaust narrative, and I would agree with you completely. And I'm interested in the way in which Simon is choosing to use these kinds of Holocaust imagistic tropes, like this pile of shoes. Here you see it when you pull back from the scene at the end, you see that it's a shoe shop that has been decimated in the pogrom, but the pile of shoes is so resonant with the Holocaust. So while von Ribbentrop never came to the White House, there was perhaps more sympathy among Americans than we generally realize in Nazi Germany. And more than that, historians like James Whitman have traced how the creators of Nazi ideology mined American racism for models to export to Germany. So in plot, Roth's alternative history isn't totally far-fetched. And some of you will have seen the article in yesterday's Times where there's a bunch of people who don't like the restrictions on COVID marching in Berlin, and they're inspired by Trump to have these marches and to defy the desire to wear masks. So having said that, and with all due respect to Roth's claims that the historical fiction that he creates here isn't about the present, it does resonate very strongly now, especially the changes that Simon made to the end of the novel in the final episode of the miniseries, which includes a chilling scene of ballots being burned. That feels very close to home now as we prepare for what might be quite a dramatic election this November. And yes, both uncannily, the 1942 election historically and in the series was on November 3rd, just as ours is going to be. I wanted to read you two quotes. How am I doing on time, Norm?
Yeah, got a couple minutes left. I had a follow-up if you want it, but if you want to continue with this, then.
Okay, I just wanted to read you two brief quotes from Roth about the way in which this isn't about current reality, but of course I think it actually is. So with all due respect, may his memory be for a blessing, it really is. So he said during the Bush years, Roth says, George W. Bush is a man unfit to run a hardware store, let alone a nation like this one. Right, so he says, you know, I couldn't really have made Plot Against America about Bush because he's not, you know, not capable. And then he says in 2018, however prescient Plot Against America might seem to you, there's surely one enormous difference between the political circumstances I invent there for the US in 1940 and the political calamity that dismays us so today. It's the difference in stature between a President Lindbergh and a President Trump. Charles Lindbergh, in life as in my novel, may have been a genuine racist and anti-Semite and a white supremacist, but he was also, because of the extraordinary feat of his solo flight, etc., an authentic American hero. Trump, by comparison, is a massive fraud, the evil sum of his deficiencies, devoid of everything but the hollow ideology of a megalomaniac. So it was, you know, of course, Roth wants it to not be about the current reality, but I think that Simon is making a very explicit choice, especially in the final episode, for those of you who've seen the series, to make it very much about now. I'll pause there because I feel like I'm out of time, but I do have more to say about Jewish anxiety, which we can get to in the questions.
More to say about what?
About your second part about Jewish anxiety, which I did.
Okay, we'll certainly get to that.
Yeah.
Gabriel Rosenfeld, we can turn to you now. The Plot Against America is what we would call a counterfactual. That is a what if, a novel and a program that portends an alternate history with frightening outcomes. You've thought and written a great deal about counterfactual history, particularly with regard to Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And over the decades, as you've written, there have been a number of counterfactual histories concerning Nazi Germany, novels, films, television programs, and there are more than one getting attention today. The two series on Amazon, The Man in the High Castle, which is quite popular. Why is it important for us to understand counterfactual narratives on their own terms and in their own moments? And what might the Plot Against America say about the US in 2004 and now in 2020. But the first question I think people would like to know, why is it important for us to understand counterfactual narratives on their own terms like this?
Yeah, thanks, Norm. Thanks for the invitation. Those are great questions. I think the first thing to emphasize, and I really just have 3 points that I'll touch on in my 5 to 6 minutes. The first thing is that this is not a one-off. The Plot Against America, of course, is perhaps the most famous work of alternate history, certainly by the most prominent writer on the topic of an alternate history that imagines the Nazis doing things that might help them win the Second World War. But there's a very, very rich history, as you've already just suggested, to this premise, this sort of plot point. And in my book, The World Hitler Never Made, Norm, that you mentioned at the outset from 2005, I analyzed more than 100 novels, films, short stories, even comic books, dealing with issues and questions pertaining to how the history of Nazi Germany might have played out differently. History texts, for example, about the Nazis winning World War II, texts that deal with Hitler never being born, or the Holocaust being completed, or never taking place at all. And so this is, very much a fertile area for counterfactual speculation, just like the South winning the Civil War is, plus any number of other themes. So in order to kind of set the stage for the Plot Against America and for us really understanding it, I think it's important to just mention a couple of key texts that preceded it, and that maybe help answer, Norm, your second question, why is it that we do, why is it that we engage in this enterprise of wondering how history might have been different? Really, since 1945, I'd say there's probably 4 to 5 dozen novels, films, and so forth about the Nazis winning World War II, or taking root in America, or maybe conquering England and occupying it, or maybe even never being overthrown and remaining in power in Germany for several generations. Philip K. Dick's 1962 novel, The Man in the High Castle, of course, sort of got the genre up and running in 1962 when that novel came out. Noel Coward, however, the famous British playwright, already in 1948, wrote a famous play called Peace in Our Time, riffing off the Neville Chamberlain comment from 1938 after the Munich Conference, in which Nazi Germany in 1941 invades Great Britain with Operation Sea Lion, conquers the country, and then subjects it to a very long occupation. And what his play explores, of course, is how the British behave. Are they going to collaborate? Are they going to resist? Fast forward to 1992, Robert Harris, the famous British journalist and author, his novel Fatherland, which also, by the way, was turned into a fairly low-budget HBO series in 1995, that also portrays the idea of Hitler being in his 80s and triumphing in World War II and trying to make peace with John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s. There's countless such narratives that we can point to in the past, but I think the first of the 3 points I want to make here is that we are living at this moment in a very, very fertile time period for this kind of literature. Just for the sake of limiting it to the subject of Nazism, and we could look at any number of other alternate history shows that have gotten big budget series behind them, whether on Hulu or Amazon or Netflix. The Man in the High Castle, which just concluded as a series, it ran for 4 seasons, starting first under the Obama administration and for the last 3 seasons rather under Trump. On HBO also, Watchmen just got nominated for 26 Emmys. It was the most heavily nominated show for the upcoming Emmy Awards, and it takes place in a world where Richard Nixon won the Vietnam War, and there's a new order in America, but right-wing nationalists, white nationalists are coming onto the scene, and there needs to be an effort to combat them. Or finally, Amazon Prime's series starring Al Pacino, Hunters, which portrays Nazi hunters in the 1970s in New York City, trying to track down a bunch of unrepentant Nazi sympathizers who have infiltrated the American government or trying to create a Fourth Reich. So, the proliferation of these kinds of texts today clearly tell us that for whatever reason, and I think probably the reason's obvious, exploring nightmares that never took place is very much the order of the day. So that's point one. We're very much in a mode of exploring nightmares, and that history goes back to the 40s. Second of all, though, I think it's important to note that in exploring any nightmare scenario, every single work of counterfactual history doesn't just point out how the past might have been different, it expresses something about the present. And counterfactual nightmares do one of two things, at least structurally, in terms of the function of the narrative. Either a nightmare of the past that never took place, is meant to validate the present, sort of as Leibniz would have said in, Candide, Voltaire and Candide, the best of all possible worlds. When we imagine how history could have been worse, we're sort of implicitly saying, well, we're glad the way it turned out. That's one function that you can see oftentimes being informing alternate histories in the context of nightmares. But however, there's a second one, which is that alternate history nightmares can also implicitly critique the present, can express worries about the present and future. And in this context, I think it's fairly obvious, as Brett was just alluding to, that Roth's novel initially, and of course the HBO series adaptation today, expressed concerns and fears, domestic political concerns and fears about America first under the Bush administration. In 2004, when Roth's novel first came out, of course, we're living in the world, in the period of the War on Terror, the Patriot Act, surveillance programs and so forth. And many American liberals, I need not tell anyone here in the audience, were quite concerned about the potential for America to go in a fascist direction. And while Roth, Brett, as you pointed out, tried to reject such a literal connection between his fiction and a political intent, certainly that's how the novel was read. And it's even more obvious as a critique of the American government when you look at the HBO series and how it's applying many of the same fears to the Trump administration. Third, and finally, I'll just conclude with this. We will, I hope, have a chance in the question and answer period to talk about the novel's plausibility. The notion that, in fact, America might have truly been ripe for fascism, which some of us perhaps today might be willing to entertain. Others would be very eager to refute, and we'll talk about that. But what I do think is worth highlighting is that Roth's novel, when it came out in 2004, lent tremendous literary legitimacy to alternate history as a literary genre. Up until that point, sure, you'd have sci-fi writers like Philip K. Dick or other somewhat niche writers exploring what-if scenarios in the form of fiction. But when Roth lent his prestige to that genre, it sort of created a chain reaction whereby subsequent novelists, for example, Michael Chabon in his Yiddish Policemen's Union about 3 or 4 years later, explored the premise of the Holocaust taking place differently and at least 1/3 of the Jews of Europe escaping to a Jewish homeland in Alaska. You also have the recent novel by Curtis Sittenfeld called Rodham about Hillary Clinton not actually marrying Bill and how her life would have turned out differently, which is a best-selling New York Times novel. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, including Stephen King's novel 11/22/63 about JFK not being assassinated. I guess what I'd like to close with is that we're sort of living in a new golden age of alternate history. And while Roth's text is something that we're certainly concerned with today, it's really just the tip of the iceberg. So I invite anyone who's interested in delving more into this genre to do so, because we're living in a very, very unique time period where what-ifs are all the rage.
God, thank you very much for that. And Rachel Gordon, you are a specialist in American Jewry in the 20th century, particularly after World War II. But what I want to ask you is this: what do we get from the plot against America, and what do we not get from the plot against America about American Jews in the 1940s? For instance, how do Roth's Jews in Newark in the early 1940s define their Jewishness? How do they define their Americanness? But to what degree are we looking at some kind of an accurate reflection or a reflection that omits certain things about American Jews in the 1940s? You're muted, Rachel.
Thank you, Norm. One of the scenes in the first episode, which my two classes this year at University of Florida have been talking about this past week, is of the Lindbergh speech he gave in Des Moines, and he actually gave it in September 1941, and Roth sets this earlier in the novel. But what Roth is able to convey in the novel and the show also makes clear is how scary it was for American Jews to hear Charles Lindbergh blame Jews as one of 3 groups that Lindbergh thought was pushing the US into the war at a time when most of the US was still isolationist. So what we don't get in Roth's Counterfactual and in the show is that, in fact, this was roundly condemned. And I have a quote here from the Christian Century magazine at the time. They note that 100 clubs and hotel foyers rang with denouncement of Lindbergh on the morning after his Des Moines speech, clubs and hotels barring their doors to Jews. So the Christian Century, this sort of mainline Protestant magazine, is noting both that everyone is criticizing Lindbergh and the hypocrisy or the cognitive dissonance that Americans are willing to sit with, that it is now becoming unacceptable to be publicly anti-Semitic the way Charles Lindbergh is, even at the same time that everybody still belongs to country clubs or stays at hotels that bar Jews. So it's an interesting time for the US in terms of anti-Semitism, and not all of that is captured in Roth's novel. But Lindbergh is, in fact, although in his speech he's calling Jews un-American, in effect, what ends up happening in real life in 1941 is Lindbergh's celebrity is tarnished, and he ends up being called un-American by politicians, by newspapers all over the country. And this isn't to say, of course, that anti-Semitism starts going down then. It becomes clear that Americans don't want to think of themselves as the kind of people who are publicly anti-Semitic in the way that Lindbergh is in that speech, and in the way that starts to look too close to the way Hitler is. And Americans are, will soon really begin to define themselves in contrast to Hitler and the Nazis. Another thing that Roth seems really interested in exploring in the novel is American Jews' fear at this time. And maybe our person who's handling the chat can enter the link for this, but Philip Roth had an essay in the New York Times in 2004, just before the novel came out, where he explains where he got his ideas for the novel and why he decided to write it. And it was because he was reading the memoirs, I think, of Arthur Schlesinger, and he decides that he wants to capture this fear that Schlesinger writes about as experiencing as a young Jew in the 30s and 40s. So I think that really comes across. It's in one of the early episodes that we see the Levin family, after Herman Levin, the father, gets a promotion, and they're visiting this this nicer part of New Jersey. I think it's Union, New Jersey, where they might get to buy their own house. So they would be really moving up because they don't have a one-family home at the time. And they realize that this nicer part of New Jersey would not be a friendly place for a Jewish family to live. And so they're not able to ascend the ladder and sort of realize their American dreams. And I think that sense of Americans still early in the 40s, because of anti-Semitism, not really being able to reach for the next rung because they sense that the public schools wouldn't be friendly to their kids, or the neighborhoods wouldn't be a good place. And in the novel, the Roth mother, Bess Levin, as she's called, realizes, oh, this would be just like it was in Elizabeth, New Jersey, where she grew up and where she remembers being the only Jewish kid in her class, and what an unfriendly and sad experience that was. So Roth does capture that. And I think that another important thing I just want to add is how not central religion is for this family. They're really trying to become American, and that's sort of what they have their eyes set on. And in the novel, Roth makes clear, I think he says explicitly, that religion, Judaism, wasn't a big deal for the family. And in the show, they have a sort of an Orthodox man come to the door and ask for money, and the father gives it to him in an effort to be charitable and look good in front of his kids. But the man is collecting for Palestine, and that the family has a little conversation where the parents reassure their children, you know, our homeland is here. So they don't have that feeling for Israel, which is of course not a state yet, but their eyes are really set on being American, and they're sort of almost there in the early 40s. It feels like they're on the cusp of a more full acceptance. But of course, what happens in the novel and the show with Lindbergh winning the presidency ends up changing the course of the family and all Jews in America.
Can I ask you one follow-up, Rachel? Thank you. You know, numerous manifestations of anti-Semitism have reared their heads in recent years, as we all know. And of course, there are Jewish anxieties today, as there should be. But how do you think the early 1940s American Jewish reality that Roth sets up compares with the American Jewish identity today?
Well, today, I mean, I often ask my students this, and they feel like they've experienced anti-Semitism in their young lives in a way that I think I wouldn't have answered yes to when I was in college, more around the turn of the century. So I think it's true that you know, young Jews have experienced these anti-Semitic incidents, but what Roth describes in the novel, and it comes across just a little bit less in the show, I think, is that Jews growing up in the 30s and 40s were so steeped in anti-Semitism that they took it for granted as a fact of life, as part of the air they breathed, that it was completely expected. And in a way, you actually didn't discuss it in the way we do today. Sort of, it's a good sign that today it's enough of a sort of surprise, or in a way unexpected, that these are noticeable incidents, whereas it seemed more an unpleasant fact of life, you know, as Roth describes it. And so your question about how that affects American identity, I think it's a challenge or a hurdle in the way of these characters trying to fully assume their American identity. And Roth does show that, and it comes through in the actor's portrayal. I think especially Herman Levin, the father, you really see him trying to be a strong American male, especially as his children walk on. And there's that very chilling scene where the family is kind of blocked entry to their hotel. You know, their bags are taken from their room, and the children are scared, and the parents and the father is humiliated, and that's a result of anti-Semitism. And here they are on vacation in Washington, D.C., the capital of the nation, and it's supposed to be this feel-good American moment, and then this happens as though they're outsiders in their own country. So the level of anti-Semitism in the novel is such that it ends up getting in the way, I think, of their fully assuming the American identity that, you know, they kind of feel is rightfully theirs.
Well, thank you. And thank you to everyone on the panel for having patiently answered my questions and sort of put the novel and the film in some context. We have some questions from the audience, and we will get to some of them, but I want to indulge my privilege as moderator by putting one to the group. You haven't really discussed the rather frightening character of Rabbi Bengelsdorf, especially as played by John Turturro, who has played Jews in other films, Herbert Stemple in Quiz Show and Joey Knish in Rounders. Here he plays this very charming Southern rabbi who has roots that he seems to be proud of to the Confederacy, and he has this idea, a very alternate vision of what it means or what it should mean to be an American Jew. And he becomes, as some of us have seen and as all of us saw in the trailer, he becomes a supporter of Lindbergh, one might also say a collaborator of Lindbergh as well. and we've talked about since 2016 sort of the terrible practice of normalizing things that we ought to see as completely abnormal. There's a moment in this film, for me, it's just, to use an academic term, gross. Just this very odd scene at the White House dinner where Rabbi Bengelsdorf and his Jewish wife, played by Winona Ryder, Evelyn, are sort of the token Jews at the White House dinner for Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister. The real Ribbentrop, as many know, was this really boorish character who sort of purchased his nobility or faked his nobility and all of that. But in the film, Ribbentrop is very tall, he's very suave. But there's this moment where he asks Evelyn to dance, and she dances with him. And to me, that's just this this moment that is sort of horrible in a different way. We kind of expect to see violence from pogroms and these sorts of things, which we see later in the film. But this moment is almost nauseating, and I can't decide whether it's because of this normalization, if it's because of this disastrous vision that Rabbi Bengelsdorf has. I'm asking the whole panel, what do you think of this character, Bengelsdorf, and perhaps what do you think of that particular scene or other scenes involving him and Evelyn? Jack?
I love the Bengelsdorf character. I don't mean in the sense of liking, I mean in the sense that I found a fascinating, riveting character. And the fact he was so delusional, right to the very end, where he believes this story of that somehow the Nazis had captured the baby and that
the Lindbergh baby.
Lindbergh baby, and Lindbergh was just, was sort of being controlled by them because of the baby. They had to, it just showed the delusional nature of this character. And I thought it was a strengthened character from the book. I liked it very much. It's hard to watch in certain ways. I also found the reception one of the most, of course, in terms of the film or the series, one of the more spectacular episodes within. I thought they did a very good job with it, certainly as compared to the book, which is more difficult to portray it in that kind of spectacular way. But he's obviously not a likable character, but I think he's a great character.
Brett?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Norm. I think Bengelsdorf is really, really interesting. And Gav, when we were talking earlier, you asked, are there other Southern characters in Roth? And I can't think of any. I know I see from the chat that there's some other Roth scholars out there. So if there's other Southern characters, I mean, that's also interesting that that's how he's so situated, and Turturro really plays up his Southernness. But in the novel, what he says by way of introduction of himself to the young Philip, he says, I absolutely admire Judah Benjamin, and then this is the quote part, Benjamin was a Jew and second only to Jefferson Davis in the government of the Confederacy. And he, is openly praising the way in which Judah Benjamin climbed to, be the right-hand man of the leader of the Confederacy. And he doesn't seem to have any qualms about it, right? And so, I mean, I think Bengelsdorf is a fascinating character in terms of what I'm calling in my book, Jewish Anxiety in the Novels of Philip Roth, Jewish anxiety, because he encapsulates both sides of the perpetrator and victim spectrum, right? So he, on the one hand, is in the novel and the series a perpetrator against these, kids. He sends them off to Kentucky to be assimilated. And yet at the same time, he then becomes victimized by the plot, right? The plot against the Jews, as Jack wants to call it, or the plot against America as it is in the novel. And so he gets to take both of these positions and therefore inhabits this idea of Jewish anxiety as being both an anxiety which we would expect and which is very manifest in Plot Against America about becoming victims, but it's also an anxiety about becoming a possible perpetrator, right? So I think he's a very interesting character in that vein.
I would also just add, structurally speaking, and in terms of historical precedent, I guess you could say that Bengelsdorf functions as a court Jew in the same way that 17th or 18th century Jews function with regard to their princes, whether it's, the King of France or the, Frederick the Great or the, a Habsburg monarch of some sort. So in that respect, he's only looking after himself, Bengelsdorf, but he provides, in the case of the Plot Against America, he provides a hecture for Lindbergh, because he is the Jew who can kosher Lindbergh's otherwise anti-Semitic, certainly his staff, his cabinet. The fact that at the actual reception you have this odious scene where Burton Wheeler and Henry Ford are talking to Evelyn and Bengelsdorf, and I believe it's Burton Wheeler, actually it's Henry Ford, saying, "Shouldn't you Jews be outside riling up the N-word? That's where they really belong." And so,
and she curses him out in Yiddish.
Yes, and so that's they recover their vestigial Yiddishkeit at this moment. But of course, in the very same breath, Bengelsdorf reassures himself and reassures Evelyn that, oh no, these are just the the no-goodniks who are part of Lindbergh's administration, but he himself, he's got our back, and he and his wife Anne Morrow Lindbergh, they really are, they're mensches, and it's, as Jack said, it's very much delusional. But I do wonder whether this, both in the novel, but especially in the show, when you see how Bengelsdorf is portrayed, is not really of the American Jewish community, because he's from the South, because there are scenes of him riding around on horseback, because he's got that rural, genteel, sort of fake, feudal Southern component to him. It's almost that he not only embraces, he embraces the worst of Jewish, self-denial and collaboration to some degree, but he's also represents America's original sin. Someone who, is a twofer in terms of badness. And I don't know if that's a little bit of a cop-out, but certainly, if he had made Bengelsdorf, a rabbi from Brookline, it might be a little bit of a different kind of symbolism.
Gav, I beg to differ.
Go ahead.
Because he apologizes. He talks about the fact his grandfather, whatever, was, fought for the South, but he said that the cause was an evil cause. He admits that it wasn't the righteous cause. So I think he's a complex character in that sense. In all fairness to him, I don't want to defend.
I guess he could have lost the horse in the accent.
The rabbi and the Jew on the horse is an hysterical figure.
That I will agree with you on.
What does this mean?
Well, it's not just a Jew on the horse. He's really an equestrian. He has an English saddle, which they take some effort to show. He's wearing the tweed that you're supposed to wear and the high boots, and where he's riding in New Jersey, I'm not entirely sure.
Right.
But
in other words,
Jews on horses and rabbis on horses.
He's at home in America, and I think that's what the whole thing shows.
Yeah.
He's where he should be. And that's what he's trying to do to the Jewish community, to make them at home in America and stop being so clustered, so ghettoized. It's an interesting idea.
Yeah. The South in general also figures really interestingly in the novel. It's not in the series at all, in the figure of Leo Frank, who is an Atlanta Jew who in 1913 is arrested for a murder that he most likely didn't commit, and then 2 years later is lynched by the group that then becomes what we now know of as the KKK, right? The second reemergence of the KKK evolves out of this lynching of Leo Frank. They're sort of galvanized by that. So it's interesting too to think about, it's like a half page or page reference in the novel and not at all in the series, but it's interesting to think about the South in both of those veins there.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Being at home in America and not really.
Yeah.
But is he at home in Judaism? There's an odd thing with him and the Evelyn character, again played by Winona Ryder. But she says to him at one point, "I don't even know the Hebrew alphabet." which is perfectly fine with him as a rabbi for reasons I guess we can try and figure out. But then he says at one point regarding the Talmud, well, I wonder if any of it amounts to really anything, which I've been around long enough. I don't recall any rabbis saying that.
He's a Yeke, he's a German Jew.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
part of what's being portrayed is this sort of tension between the East European Jews and the German Jews, especially the assimilated Southern German Jews. So I think the character is pretty consistent, but just to add to that, the wonderful scene is when Evelyn goes to shul and she doesn't know what to do. And I found that was just wonderful. It's beautifully portrayed. I don't remember in the book whether it captures it, but the series does it brilliantly.
During the Elenu, and she doesn't know.
She doesn't know what to do.
There was a question from the audience that I would like to throw out. It had to do, if I can find it again. It said, could the panelists please discuss the HBO series opening credits? It's a montage that also includes, aside from pictures of Lindbergh, Nazi perpetrator footage from the Holocaust. Can I have your thoughts on this as historical artistic practice? I think this is one that anyone would grab. Brett?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'm so glad somebody asked that because I was hoping to have an opportunity to talk about the introduction. It's so fascinating to me because the way, and I wish I could show it, but for people who have seen it, it morphs basically between images of Lindbergh, you know, the historical Lindbergh, and then the actor sneaks in at the end, and then images from not only Nazi Germany, but also images from concentration camps. It uses those images that were taken by a Sonderkommando inside the camp, and they're very blurry images that are very graphic and disturbing. And yet while the whole thing is playing, the overlay is this super cheesy, corny song. Somebody probably knows this song better than I do, but the stark juxtaposition between the black and white, grainy, archival images, and then this like, everything's gonna be wonderful, glorious in America kind of cheeseball music is really, really, really striking. And he also, in the introductory segment, it plays each time. The introductory segment doesn't shift for all 6 episodes of the series. And you see also a whole lot of scenes of propaganda. So it's packed into this very short opening segment, a sense of the stark difference between the violent reality of Nazi Germany and what we have in a Lindbergh presidency, plus the way in which it's basically saying it can and it is happening here, right? It's blurring that line between Germany and America, as I think also the final scene that I showed in the PowerPoint does, where you have the shop, Death to Jews in English, and then you have, you know, German graffiti on a shop in Berlin as an archival image. So I think it's a really fascinating opening.
Mm-hmm.
What do everybody else think about it?
Agree.
You put it well.
We have another question. It has to do with what would have happened, or what do you think would have happened, not just to American Jews, but sort of geopolitically, if these events had come to pass.
Well, I mean, that's a classic what if scenario. And usually people who are skeptical about the utility of counterfactual thinking will say, you know, the further you fast forward the tape of history, 1 year into the future, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years, it gets less and less plausible, and you end up just really using your imagination and expressing your own prejudices and biases. But I think one thing that we could certainly say is that had Lindbergh been president in 1940, the United States never would have gotten involved in World War II. We would not have had interventionism, we would have had isolationism. And the consequences for Europe, for the United States, for the Jews, would have been fairly considerable, although, you know, depending on what theater you're looking at, what year, you know, there can be a lot of variation. But I do think that the good war consensus about, and I talk a lot about this in my book, The World Hitler Never Made, the whole idea since 1945 that America, in intervening in World War II, in 1941, ended up representing a noble cause, a moral cause, a good cause against absolute evil, which of course is the essence of the good war, concept that comes from the 1980s in Studs Terkel's book. That good war consensus has been time and time again ratified and validated by imagining how terrible history would have been in fact, America didn't get involved in the war. And whether it's because Lindbergh's president or because FDR was assassinated in 1933 in Miami, which he almost was, as some of you may know, these nightmare scenarios are an example of nightmares validating history as it really happened, as working out all for the best. So I think, it certainly would have been an example of history turning out worse. It's hard to imagine history turning out better. Although there have been people like Pat Buchanan who have argued that if only America had stayed neutral in World War II, then Hitler could have defeated Stalin. We wouldn't have had a Cold War, and we could have lived happily ever after with that extremely rational politician, Adolf Hitler. That's a very benign interpretation, needless to say, of Hitler, but there have been more than a few people who, in the wake of 9/11, as part of the revision of the good war consensus, there have been people who've said, maybe we shouldn't have gotten involved in the war. Whether from the far left or the far right.
I guess adding to Gav's point there is that if this had happened the way Roth shows it, we wouldn't have had the merging of American and Jewish interests as seemed to happen in the U.S. that and all that flows from that, such that historians consider the decade after World War II this golden era or golden decade for American Jews. So even though it's bad in the early 1940s, the post-war era ends up being the beginning of a pretty good, or certainly an uphill period for Jews and a decrease in anti-Semitism. And it's also interesting, I guess, to me to think how Roth wrote this in the early 2000s when, I guess from my perspective now, the 90s and the beginning of this century, that seems like a golden era in American Jewish experience. And it was sort of maybe easy and light for him at that moment to imagine what it might have been like if things had gone sour in the way that his novel shows. Whereas now we look at this novel and this show and we might all think we see certain parallels to our own time in certain ways.
Jack, and then I want to get to some more questions.
I want to pose a question to the group if I can. And the question I want to pose is what people think of this text. And forget about the issue of the reality and the counterfactuals. As a piece of writing, as a piece of fiction in terms of the series or the novel. I know when I first read it, years ago, I wasn't that impressed. I thought, it's not one of Roth's better works. When the film came out, when the series came out, I was very impressed. I really, whatever the weaknesses were, I was deeply moved by it. I couldn't wait until each week, until the next episode, next installment. And I found myself in preparing for this discussion, rewatching it and finding it just as riveting as it was the first time, and then rereading the book and liking it much more than the first time I'd read the book. And I'm curious, what other people think.
I'll just say 20 seconds worth of my own recollection. In 2004, I read it specifically looking for its counterfactual elements. And I got really impatient after 250, 300 pages. There was a background veneer of counterfactualism, but my thought was at the end of the novel, he kind of ran out of gas and just sort of came up with this Deus Ex Machina with, we don't have to engage in spoilers for people who still want to read the novel, but it was a kind of exercise for him, I thought, not only exploring Jewish anxiety, but also genre, a new genre for him. And I didn't think it was as expert as it might have been had he been more immersed in the genre, but that's probably a niche interpretation.
Yeah, and I also, I'm just noting, my mother points out that Pearl Harbor, yes, anyone would have been pulled in after Pearl Harbor. So I don't think anyone was denying that.
Well,
yes, but Pearl Harbor would not have occurred because Lindbergh presumably would have traded scrap metal to the Japanese, which was why the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So, yeah.
it does become a feedback loop at a certain point with variables changing other variables.
But in response to Gav, I mean, I think at the time the book came out, the criticism of him, of the novel, was that it was not a particularly good counterfactual thing. That if you wanted something better, you would look at, It Can't Happen Here was a more expert book than this. And I thought in reading It Can't Happen Here recently, the difference to me was that Sinclair Lewis had a very open vision of the story. He gave himself free rein for his imagination to think of what happens if the country goes fascist. Whereas the striking difference in this book is that it's very controlled. It doesn't really give much room for all that much to happen. He evokes a possibility, but the truth of the matter is not fascist. The country doesn't go fascist. It goes somewhat potentially authoritarian and certainly anti-Semitic. But there's no real alliance with Hitler, and there's certainly no attempt to transform America into a fascist state. It's not that counterfactual.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Gav, your point about, the way in which it's not adhering to the sort of rules of counterfactuality is interesting in light of what you also said, which is that it has become one of the most famous counterfactual texts, right? But to answer your question, Jack, I mean, I really liked the novel, and I liked it in 2004 as well as rereading it. I didn't have the experience you did of not liking it at first and then coming to like it later, because from the beginning, I just thought there's something really wonderful about the family called the Philip Roth family in Weequahic, which is his life, and I find it's also great as a teaching text, because if you're teaching it, and in part of what you can teach students through reading the novel with them is that look at how the changes happen are so incremental, right? So the Roth family in the novel are, going along, they're in their Jewish world, and then bit by bit, it becomes darker and darker and harder to, do things like, move to Canada for their safety or so on and so forth. Their liberties get restricted in much the same way as when the Nurembergs come in 1935 in Germany. German Jews are having, incrementally seeing how the change happens, because so often students will say to us, right, well, why didn't they all just get it? Or why didn't they all just leave? And I think one of the things that Roth does incredibly well is show from a kid's perspective, what it's like to go through those changes as they happen.
Yeah, another response to reading the novel, I guess I was struck by his tenderness towards the parents, which, from what I read about him after, really was about sort of giving respect to what it had meant for his parents to be Jewish working class adults in the 30s and 40s, especially the mother, and his description of all that all those mothers in New Jersey were doing. And I think I saw someone in the Q&A asked about a comparison between this novel and Roth's 1959 Goodbye Columbus, where he seemed to have such tenderness for this couple in love. And in this novel, I thought it was towards the parents. I guess I was curious, with someone who was more of a parenting expert, or the history of parenting, it seemed almost a little unrealistic that these early 1940s parents were so concerned about the feelings of their children, and I think the mother only slapped the child once, but they were very kind of gentle, I thought almost modern parents.
Mm-hmm.
We have a wonderful question that I would like to pose. It reads as follows. I have a question for the panel. The Holocaust is hardly mentioned in the show, if I remember correctly, and I can't help but asking whether this is the hidden core of the plot against America, the story of a somewhat guilt-ridden Jewish American community who live in a mostly comfortable life in the US without having to really sacrifice what Jews of the world had sacrificed, and ultimately saying, listen, although it didn't happen here, and probably is not going to happen here, well, it could have. In this sense, the story also ignores what a Lindbergh administration would have meant to other minorities in America, specifically the African American community, who of course don't really need a fictional alternate history.
But they did sacrifice, and they sacrificed by sending their children off to war. And this is the subtext here. Did America have to do that? And in theory, no. But in fact, people voluntarily, the country voluntarily agreed to participate in Europe's war. And Canada before, I mean, Alvin has to go up to Montreal, to go up to Canada in order to join the Canadian Armed Forces and get severely wounded, but because he believed in sacrificing for a greater cause. So I don't think that's correct. I'm sorry for dismissing the comment. I didn't really mean to do that, but I want to but because I was on my mind also something that Brett had said. One of the fascinating scenes in the novel, but also especially in the series, is the refugees, what I call refugees, those who decided to move to Canada, and to see the caravans really of people taking their belongings, going from Newark and going up to Winnipeg or wherever else they were going. I found that to be a haunting scene.
Yeah,
I could get back to that question. Oh, sorry, Gov, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and for anyone who's contemplated doing that seriously or facetiously today, you can't do it because of COVID. So, some of us have played out these, in game theory kind of terms, could I drive from Connecticut to Canada? No, not today. But the stream of automobiles, I agree, Jack, that was a very, poignant and scary scene.
And I was thinking, what do I do with my stereo system? Get it up there.
But the person who asked the question said that the Holocaust is never mentioned. And, it's mentioned, but it's mentioned very obliquely. And again, the rabbit hole of the counterfactual, I'm never quite sure what to do with it. But word arrived in the United States from Switzerland in November of 1942 that Europe's Jews were being systematically deported and murdered. That sort of half went through the State Department, and whether it would have gone through a Lindbergh State Department is questionable. But information started to come out. And so when the character Herman says, Jews are being beaten and shot, by 1942, Jews knew anyway, that it was much more than that, and it was showing up in the Jewish newspapers. I mean, even if it wasn't showing up in the New York Times or showing up in the back pages of the New York Times, it was certainly showing up in the Jewish newspapers. And Jewish families, lots of them, had relatives, mostly in Poland, where the quotas were tiny, who could not get to the United States. And, of course, we have lots and lots of accounts of families who were quite worried, terrified for the safety of their families. These things don't come up in the book or in the movie. And I think it's a good question. Why not? Is it for Roth simply a complicating element that he doesn't really want to get into that deeply? Would it complicate the story too much? I'm just curious what you all think.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I hadn't actually really thought about that, which is funny. Like, you would think that I would, given how much I've thought about the way that the Holocaust appears in a lot of Roth's other work, like, in Portnoy's Complaint and, and Ghostwriter and so on and so forth. It's certainly, the Holocaust overall is a theme for Roth, absolutely. So it is interesting that it isn't more prevalent in this. And I guess, just speculating, I would say that it's because he wants to focus on what the Holocaust in America would look like, and not necessarily to compare it to what the Holocaust was looking like already in Europe, right? So that he wants it to be, the focus is so much, and Jack, you're absolutely right, this novel, and also many of Roth's other novels, is so much about citizenship and the way in which Jews are American, or struggling to configure themselves as only American, even while external forces want to see them as not American, right? Want to see us as not American. So that, I think, is certainly.
I could add to it. In the novel, the family thinks they're going to go on vacation in Ottawa. And in the film version, they go to Washington. And that switch is fascinating to me. And of course, they don't go to Ottawa in the novel. They just think about doing it.
Yeah, but in the novel, they also go to DC because they're so patriotic,
So,
right? So they have to, Herman has to show the kids the great American scenes because he's so patriotic, right?
Oh, there's nothing to do in Ottawa.
I'd like to get to a couple of questions from UF students as well. This one is from a Jewish UF student, and I'll quote, "As we see what's happening in Seattle and Portland, the anxieties I'm hearing from my peers is eerily similar to the conversations that the Jews of Europe were having in the late 1930s. What is the best way forward for us coming up on election night?" Well, that's a hard question. And the uncertainty of what might come after. In other words, what if things play out very badly here? He's asking that as a Jewish student.
Well, the first thing is it's very important to vote. Everybody, all students out there who may be considering not voting, vote.
Right, and vote early and vote often.
And it's obvious
Vote once.
to register to vote first. It's not a self-evident thing. And
Yes.
we know how many states have made it very difficult for college students to either register or also to vote in action.
Probably avoid the mail.
Right,
Yeah.
and in most cases, you could register at your university address. You don't necessarily need to register from your home, your parents' address. So that's also important, is to vote.
I mean, I think just in one other point, as a historian, it's a cliche that we're always trying to teach lessons of history, but I think in this present day context, nobody needs any historical lessons to be convinced of the need for vigilance and the need to, hold elected officials responsible and to ideally have them tell the truth and to be suspicious and not believe everything you see. And especially these days, since so many students, college students, in particular, are spending all their lives online. I have a 23-year-old and a 20-year-old. There is a tendency to believe everything you read, whether it's written by a Russian bot or a troll farm or, our president. So I think, be skeptical and look for confirmation of things that you see. I mean, there have already been, again, game theorists, I believe, in the State Department or elsewhere who have, imagined what if on election day there is a Twitter post that ends up getting circulated around the country that Joe Biden's just had a heart attack and he's not going to actually be able to, serve in any way, and that might depress turnout. I mean, we need to be, prepared for anything, but to, follow through on all of our planned actions, voting and otherwise, I'm not saying anything original here, but don't take things for granted.
I also just want to say in response to that question, thank you for that question, that to me, and I may be just overly optimistic, but everything that's happening in Portland, Seattle, Minneapolis, literally all over the country and the world, like one thing that's frustrating to me is the way in which what I see as an incredibly positive outpouring of a demand for justice gets overwritten by two things. One, the looting, and two, then the huge military response to what are generally speaking peaceful protests. So I feel as though what could be understood as just an incredibly powerful show of the people's power to say we want justice, we don't want police brutality, then gets turned into something that it really wasn't intended to be and shouldn't be perceived as.
This is another question that sort of builds on a question that we had earlier, but I think it speaks to all of us because we all study this and we all wrestle, of course, with the larger relevance to global history, particularly in our own day. Anyway, the question is as follows, also from a student. To a Jewish reader raised on the story of European Jewry unable to flee Nazi rule, the book and movie inevitably provoke powerful anxiety. But in 2020, as the Nazi era recedes into history and fades in popular memory, is the template of the European Jewish experience still evocative of fear and dread? I wonder how the book and the movie play for readers and viewers from other marginalized groups who feel vulnerable and at risk in the United States today. It's a very good question. Does this play with other groups? Help me, someone.
Well, no, I think it's a great question. I don't know exactly, but one thing that I do think is interesting, especially in the novel, it's less apparent in the series, but in the novel, there's a way in which Roth is using a lot of the sort of tropes of racism to describe anti-Semitism. And some critics who read the novel said, okay, so this isn't fair, right? You're basically taking racist ideas and incorporating them into what you're imagining as this alternative universe anti-Semitic experience, including but not limited to the KKK. And I think it's really interesting that in the series, but not in the novel itself, you see the robes and the burning, and in the novel they're mentioned, the KKK are mentioned, but you don't see them so strongly visually, obviously, as you do in the series, where they're actually on stage, as it were, and they're not on the page in the novel.
Burning something.
What?
And burning things down.
And burning things, yeah, exactly. And the Levin family encounters them on their way back from Kentucky. So I feel as though Roth is doing something that in some cases is like a little tricky with how he's using one experience to inflect another.
I would also add that if you're going to be wanting to delve into this topic a little bit more deeply and going beyond just the plot against America, if anyone were to watch the other series that I mentioned at the outset, The Man in the High Castle, Hunters, and Watchmen, the fact that those three series all have a certain narrative tendency that Roth's novel and the HBO series don't have, and that's the fact that in these three other series, when fascism is rearing its ugly head and Nazism in America is being imposed upon the population, Jews and blacks actually forge an alliance. That's something that you don't see in the plot against America. The only hint of that is when the Wishnow family is moved into Kentucky and a new Italian family comes in next door, and sort of more working class Italian guy gives them the handgun. And that sort of implies, along with a reference to Fiora LaGuardia, calling Lindbergh a fascist dupe, there's some potential for immigrant groups of, the 1880 generation joining forces, but it's only really hinted at. I think Roth really just wanted an insular look at this from a Jewish perspective. But if you look at the other three series, it's quite striking that there are multiracial alliances between Jews, African Americans, and others. And maybe here, the plot against America is the exception that proves the rule, and that these other alternate history series do maybe tap into present day desire, certainly among people who are liberal or left of center, for a multicultural alliance against, what they all have in common, which is the fight against a right-wing drift in the country.
Yeah, if I could disagree on this issue, I think that the purpose of the Italian there was because I say Roth is preoccupied with twinning with these two things. He's got the Bund is Germans. Mm-hmm. So he's got to have the good ethnic. So those are the Italian, working class Italians. And I don't think they serve any other purpose. I mean, it's like just not to denigrate all ethnics, but to show that we're also good ethnics.
And I agree. It's only in an intertextual sense when you compare this alternate history with the other ones that are all come out within 18 months of this one, that you see where one is not taking the route that the others are taking.
So I have to say that in the Man in the High Castle, I keep on saying the Man in the White Castle. What he has a basic problem, but the Man in the High Castle.
Hamburgers.
He ate his way out. But in the Man in the High Castle, I thought the interethnic alliance, at that point, the whole story got very weak. When they stuck to Nazis, the Nazi takeover of the country, or the German takeover, it's fine. It's like, I could go along with it. But they tried to resolve it in this kind of way. It just seemed very, very flat.
It is interesting. It's the difference between a series that lasts for 4 years and has 4 seasons versus a show that had 6 episodes.
Exactly.
Couple more, a number of interesting questions. This is one that we haven't really addressed. The Just Folks program, this being the government program and plot against America that sought to sort of force Jewish assimilation by sending them to the children to Kentucky, Montana, what have you. The Just Folks program seems to reference the response by a diverse group of German Jews in the 1930s to return to the soil, farm physical labor, and so on, and attack anti-Semitic stereotypes head on. the conservative Reichsbund Jüdische Frontsoldaten, that would be the German Jewish Veterans Association from World War I, ran several vocational retraining programs for Jewish youth, for example. In the plot against America, the impetus seems to come from Lindbergh's administration itself. How would you characterize the Just Folks storyline in the context of American Jewish history? Yeah, Zionism too has this back to the soil thing. It doesn't ask Jews to stop being Jews, but it does look to create a different kind of Jew.
Actually, they do.
Okay, well, but how, you're right, the secularism, okay, but how would you characterize the Just Folks storyline in the context of American Jewish history?
I think we see this throughout probably a good part of the 20th century. I was recently looking at a 1955 cover of Time magazine, which showed an Orthodox Jewish woman, sorry, not Time magazine, Life magazine, which showed an Orthodox Jewish woman blessing the Sabbath candles. And this had been an actual Jewish family in America that Life magazine sought out, and they were specifically looking for a family who is not from New York, not in banking, and not in any of the stereotypical sort of Jewish professions or other stereotypes about Jews. And so the family that they chose was a group, was a family that were farmers, and they had been in the US for 3 generations. And in 1955 still, Time Incorporated felt like it's important that we showcase this kind of Jewish family for our cover story on American Jews. So, I mean, there's some good motivation there, I suppose, in trying to show that there are Jews of all kinds in the US at a time when there still would have been plenty of anti-Semitic belief that Jews are only a certain kind of person.
Thank you. Any other comments on that?
I mean, I think, you know, that's the positive spin on it. The negative spin would be this is forced assimilation, just like the Tsar, you know, tried to get Russian Jews to, you know, serve for 25 years in the army, and that's a good way to make them not Jews anymore. So if you ship them off to Kentucky and you teach them how to, you know, shoot pheasants or whatever, then, you know, they're gonna become like good American Protestants, white American Protestants, and so on and so forth. I remember, you know, in the novel, I don't remember if it's in the TV series as much, but Walter Winchell refers to these, you know, these relocation camps as they're in the Office of American Absorption as basically concentration camps. And, you know, there's a more sinister spin to it, although I'm sure Bengelsdorf, when he and Evelyn are conceiving of this, they may have been driven by some kind of, you know, Jewish desire to go back to the land, and, you know, but, you know, is it rooted in self-hatred? Is it rooted in, you know, real desires for assimilation, or is it just, you know, again, doing the government's dirty work for it?
Oh, Bengelsdorf, sorry, I mean, it's sort of replicating himself, right? He's a Southern Jew. He's sort of he's at home in America, and he wants to take these East Coast Jews, these non-Yekas, people who have not been here for generations, and let them experience what he's experienced. The friendliness.
It's the revenge of the South against the North, is what it is.
Yes.
But it's also like, it feels to me like the Just Folks thing is so, I mean, it's Roth's way of showing the insidiousness of Bengelsdorf's position, right? That he's going to be the one who's really orchestrating this and pushing it, and he's going to be the one, I think, Gab, you used the word, to kosher the Just Folks movement for the Jews of Newark, who are so rightly resistant to it, right? So I think it's a way to show this kind of sense of what it's like to be a collaborationist, really.
Sure.
That's the other thing. What if we read this whole text as an allegory? What if the whole thing is really a Holocaust allegory? And that I was just thinking about this earlier today, and I haven't thought this through, but I'll throw it out to see if you want to run with this. What if, you know, he's really, you know, so Bengelsdorf is like a capo, and, you know, or you name it. I mean, you've got these various characters here who play out certain roles within the Holocaust. And that's really what the story's about.
Yeah, so Roth apparently, according to Claudia Roth-Pierpont, or Pierpont-Roth, I can't remember which way her name goes, he had a very early text that he abandoned, which was all about a collaborationist in Germany, and who was part of the Judenrat, and but he never finished that text. So I hadn't thought it through either, but it's an interesting possibility.
Somebody also asked the question, and it's essentially this. If something like this came to pass today, would we stop using Nazis as a trope? In other words, would the Nazis in the government become so offended by our use of Nazis, right, that we wouldn't use them anymore? But the larger question
there are some very fine people on that side.
On both sides, I know. But the larger question is, Gav can address this, and the rest of you certainly can too. We use Nazism as kind of our archetype of evil. What would we do without them is sort of the question, and I'm not sure quite how to pose it based on what's here, but if not the Nazis, they say, then who? In other words, if we didn't have the Nazis, then who would we use for these?
Right, I mean, this is the problem where, I published a couple months ago an article about the 4-year plus debate about whether there are more or less similarities between Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler, as the media in America and elsewhere have, been debating this for some time. I think the problem, substance aside from, the problem with making this comparison is that we let Hitler suck all the air out of the room, and we forget that there was George Wallace, and we forget that there was Joseph McCarthy, and we forget that there were other people in American history, the know-nothings in the 19th century who were anti-immigrant. Not everybody who is, right of center, even far right of center, has to necessarily conform to Hitler and fascism. And, if we make him the archetype of evil, it ends up sort of diluting our reservoir of other historical analogies that we probably should know a lot about. Our historical vocabulary has become somewhat impoverished because Hitler has, monopolized everything and become a hegemonic analogy. At the same time, of course, nobody wants to underestimate the threat. And so, as a default response, Hitler is always the first person who's invoked.
He has sucked the air out of the room, you've got to admit.
And the question is are we all the better off for that? Or has, we cried wolf so many times and nobody's listening anymore?
I mean, I think the question also got to sort of the use of Hitler, or his function, at least in the decade or the few decades after World War II. It became so unacceptable to be anything resembling Hitler's level of anti-Semitic, and it probably had some effect on our ideas about racism as well. So I think of, I guess I keep on thinking of McCarthyism. Even though he became an ism, did any of our other examples really have anything near the power of Hitler as a symbol of evil?
Right, I think it's more, and I think because no matter how much it's important for us to invoke the Holocaust here, I actually think that this novel and film are much more about a country descending into authoritarianism and maybe outright fascism, just like the Germans after World War II spent the first 30 years not writing about the Holocaust. They wrote about how their democracy collapsed into fascism. I think this is arguably just as much what this novel is about, and the TV show as well. So in that line of reasoning, I think, probably the idea of McCarthy being a precedent for America in an anti-communist mode of hysteria, taking us away from all our civil liberties and, leading people to get blacklisted. And the same with George Wallace, carries 4 states in 1968. And if he doesn't get shot in whatever it is, 72, maybe he actually, can get elected president. There have been people who have played this theory out as well. So, I think right now, maybe as Jews.
I'm wrong. This novel, the story, is not about fascism. It's not about the country descending into fascism, but into public anti-Semitism. And they're not the same.
It's true. However, for example, the way that the police, when they escort the Roth family out of the hotel, the police are not they're dealing with the Roths like many police officers deal with African Americans in America. They're not giving them equal justice. They have been co-opted by the new state. They're taking their marching orders from Lindbergh's administration. And if the police are people who can just as easily lead to, what the Germans will call Gleichschaltung and go the direction, that the new administration, go in that direction that it's setting, then that's the way that the society loses its democratic liberal freedoms. And I mean, I'm not saying it's not about the Holocaust, and it's not about anti-Semitism, but it's also about America losing its way, certainly compared to
We
the
lost it a
previous.
long time ago.
This one has Brett written all over it. In the wake of the Jessica Krug scandal, this is the Jewish academic who pretended to be African American. It was in the news past few days. In the wake of the Jessica Krug scandal, would the panel like to address race and representation in Roth, in The Human Stain and The Plot, Goodbye Columbus, etc.?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's my book, Jewish Anxiety, the novels of Philip Roth. I almost said for some reason Herman Roth. Conflating the father with the son is all about race and Roth. And yeah, I mean, what I think Roth is really quite fascinating on what he's doing with race. First of all, it's interesting and also problematic and unfortunate that, with the notable exception of Coleman Silk, who, for those of you who haven't read it, is the protagonist of The Human Stain, who is very light-skinned, Black, but passes as Jewish and uses the GI Bill to transform his class and race, and after the war ends up, quote unquote, passing as a Jewish academic, and then is disgraced for a supposedly racist slur. So it has a whole interesting sort of arc, but he's the only Black character, and that character is, for all intents and purposes, Jewish in the text, right? So there's an interesting sort of absence at the center of this very representation. But from the very earliest text, from Goodbye Columbus, for people who have read it, I don't know if you remember, there's the young Black kid in the library who reads is it Gauguin, the paintings from Tahiti with great interest in the library. And there's this whole sort of sympathy that develops between the main character and the kid. And throughout all of Roth's work, there are these Black characters, but 98% of them are just sort of plunked in momentarily. They don't have a lot of interiority. They're very, very brief in they're sort of slide through the text and come out again without a whole lot of development. And it's interesting that Roth chooses to do that. They're often structurally situated as sort of plot points rather than people. And Dean Franco has written wonderfully about the way in which race and sex are intersecting in Portnoy's complaint. So Portnoy has this constant fantasy all the time that there's going to be a giant Black man with a knife in the closet when he's, having sex, and it's this constant anxiety for him, which is not too hard to unpack, right? So it's fascinating what Roth is doing with race. There's so many ways in which race figures in his entire corpus, and a lot of it, I think, has to do with what I'm calling this dual anxiety that Roth exhibits, where on the one hand, what he's showing in part when he has his characters say racist things and then he has other characters fight them on their very racism, is that there's this other fear, this other anxiety that Jews could become the thing that led us to the Holocaust in the first place, which is racism, essentially, right? I could say more, but I don't want to go on too long.
Yeah, I was just thinking the way Brett, I don't know if you remember other characters in this novel, but in The Plot Against America, there were I think 2 African-American men who worked in the hotel that, that Philip and his brother, it's clear they're not used to seeing people like these. And so Sandy wants to draw them. But I thought the way Roth described that sort of curiosity is similar to how they feel about the Italian, the old Italian grandmother who lives next door. What when you live in a very insular neighborhood, as Roth sort of grew up, how other people end up looking to you, and it's a different kind of othering.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's also the African Americans in the warehouse where Alvin is working, and he questions him about but his career trajectory.
Mhm.
Some snide comment about that.
Yeah, and in the series, very chillingly, at the very, very end of the series, there's a lot of Black voters online whose ballots are, of course, instantly burned.
Right.
Right. So that's, yeah.
We have another inter-Jewish question here. What does the confrontation between Herman and his nephew, this would be Alvin, have to say about conversations American Jews were having in real life about World War II? I imagine this refers, if I can expand it, not only to Alvin's decision to go and fight with the Canadians against Hitler, which Herman doesn't want him to do, but also this later confrontation when Alvin sort of comes back as something of a gangster, kind of a macher, and is boasting about, he's sort of become this guy that he was driving for at one point. Sort of noting these different, these alternative paths. And in the book, it's a knockdown, drag-out fight, right, between Herman and Alvin, where everything in the living room is smashed, and you can't just go out and replace it in those days. What about that particular confrontation? We've talked about Bengelsdorf as sort of a foil, but what about that relationship? Does that reflect something about different Jewish anxieties?
I mean, it seems like for both Alvin and Herman Levin, if fear, one of Philip Roth's big themes in the novel is kind of mangling them both. I mean, Alvin sort of literally with his leg amputated, but it ends up also the fear they both feel because of the anti-Semitism and the way that they're each encountering it, it ends up bringing, I think Roth says this in the novel, like violence entered his home, that Philip is this young boy and he had never seen violence in his living room. And then here he watches his father and I guess his cousin or whatever the relation is to Alvin, he watched them having this huge fight. And so it's not even just that the danger is outside the home, but it has actually by the end, come inside. So it seems like another commentary on the way for Jews at this time, anti-Semitism ends up tearing apart people and families too.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, it's generational, because just like today, the generation of people who are in their 50s, like myself, and the generation of people who are in their 20s, we might counsel more patience than our kids are willing to, accept at this point. And Alvin's the same way. Herman's somebody who resists Bess's desire to get them on a list of, accepted immigrants to potentially go to Canada. And when he finally decides to go, it's too late. Meanwhile, Alvin wants to take up arms and lash out against the Nazis and not just sit on the side of the road, metaphorically, like Herman does. In the same way today, I think, especially on the liberal left, people who wanted Bernie Sanders, the people who wanted Joe Biden, the young people who don't vote but want more revolution, and the people who do vote and want to keep things more or less centrist. I think it's a very similar split there among the American Jews.
You're listening to the arguments in my home, apparently. But for Herman, it's about keeping things under control. That's his job. That's his role, right? He's a paterfamilias. He takes care of everybody. He earns the money, and he rescues Alvin when Alvin becomes a full orphan. I mean, he adopts him. So his job is to see that Alvin has a good life, a straight life. And Alvin is wild. He's completely untamed. And Herman sees his job to do precisely that. It's interesting that after Alvin loses his leg, the wildness gets rechanneled in even more criminal activity. But it's only at the point where he takes part in knocking down Lindbergh's plane or pushing off course, whatever it is, through this phallic object, radar object, that at that point Alvin sort of calms down somewhat, becomes more of a mensch, and so he regains his phallus.
Yeah, I think the figure of Alvin is so interesting. And in the novel, there's a big difference between the novel and the series here, which is that in the novel, Alvin and Herman have this horrible fight. And then Alvin goes off to rescue Selden with a neck brace and sutures in his face. And he's all like stitched up. And yet he drives whatever it is, 700 miles to Kentucky to get this orphaned kid, right? So, I mean, Herman is sort of in that moment even more of a hero after the fight, and the description,
the protector.
Yeah, exactly. And the description in the novel is really quite amazing of, you know, Bess had saved nickel by nickel to get this beautiful mahogany and glass table for the living room that then the two giant men with their big antlers destroy. You know, I mean, it's a beautiful passage that Roth writes there about, you know, basically this like hyper masculinity destroying all that Bess has saved and scrimped to create. And then who cleans up all the blood, right? Of course, Bess does, you know, I mean, so it's also very interesting, I think, in terms of masculinity and labor. there.
We're running out of time, and I want to post, I want to post one more question because it just came in and hasn't been raised. We haven't really talked much about Charles Lindbergh. Either the real Charles Lindbergh or the sort of fictional Charles Lindbergh. But the question was just raised. Lindbergh disappears at the end of the movie and at the end of the book. And you know, the movie posits an explanation, but the book posits several. The question is what you think personally happened to Lindbergh, which of course you can't know, but the larger question is, what does his disappearance mean metaphorically? You know, he was the villain in all of this, either deliberate or not, and he sort of ushered in all of these terrible things. But what does his disappearance mean? Not so much that the movie argues that
Trump said about the virus. What Trump said about the virus is just going to go away one day.
Yeah, I see.
Well,
yeah.
Sorry, I kept having to go. My dog is wanting to go in and out and in and out. Sorry about that. So I think
did the dog sign up for this?
It was a special.
Well, I'm sort of damned if I do and damned if I don't, because if I don't let him in, then he scratches on the door. But if I do let him in, he can. My husband is cooking downstairs, and he wants to go find out what's going to be for dinner. So anyway, but I think that the way in which Roth treats Lindbergh at the end is fascinating, and I read that as, like, here's Roth, the actual Roth, who as a kid, he's said this many times, absolutely idolized Lindbergh, right? So he then constructs this novel where Lindbergh becomes this populist president and there's all this anti-Semitism. What's he gonna do with him, right? He, Roth, can't possibly have it be true or completely true. That's why there's all of these alternative endings, that Lindbergh, his hero, is gonna become this fascist anti-Semite, right? So he has to have some kind of get out clause, I feel like, emotionally. And it's a fantastically clever thing, right? Because it's plausible, and Gab, you can talk more about within counterfactual structures, it's plausible that the Lindbergh baby, instead of being kidnapped and killed, could have been raised as Hitler Jugend in Germany, right? I mean, there's a way in which the dates add up. It's 1932 when the Lindbergh baby is kidnapped. He would be a strapping young teenager by the time that the novel takes place. And of course, that would mean that then Hitler has Lindbergh in his pocket. And, you know, it's also, I think, very resonant now for the relationship between Trump and Putin, which of course, Roth was not writing about that because it hadn't happened yet. But there's also another one of these sort of resonances. But I feel as though there's something to that kind of emotional attachment to Lindbergh that he didn't want to let go of.
I don't buy it. I think that to me, what that does is that it shows ultimately how delusional Bengelsdorf was to buy into the story. That to me is what's really chilling, is that people are willing to accept a completely farcical story. And
I mean, I would just add that in the novel, it does seem, you know, nothing is established with certainty, but if in fact this, you know, wild scheme, Brett, that you just alluded to was in fact the case, that Lindbergh was just a dupe, a pawn, a puppet of the Nazis, then of course American fascism is not internally generated. it's externally imported from outside, it's the Germans' fault again. And therefore America is sort of exonerated, or at least America's liberal bona fides are exonerated as the lesson. You know, I mean, I think it's all very implausible, needless to say. And that's where I sort of lost patience when I read it back in the day in 2004, because no matter how much, you know, you could find the timeline of the Lindbergh baby kidnapping lining up with what, you know, Brett, you just mentioned. I always think of Sir Louis Namier's famous quote that the study of history teaches more than anything else how events do not happen. And that, you know, conspiracies, no matter how tempting they are to embrace, usually don't happen the way they're portrayed. And, you know, much of history is about accidents and mistakes and confusion and two ships passing in the night, and, you know, to orchestrate something so fantastic to keep it hidden under wraps and so on and so forth. That's, you know, where I sort of tune out a little.
Yeah,
I'd like
no,
to add something else
but
here.
it's also true that we don't really know, right? That's one of the things that's interesting about the ending of the novel, is that it's
No, we
left
don't know.
completely, you
Brett,
know.
I would add something else here, which is so fascinating. Again, in this, my argument about twinning, look, as much as Lindbergh is portrayed in pretty despicable ways, whether he's a dupe or whether he himself, for whom he's a dupe, whether for Hitler or for the right wing in this country, Mrs. Lindbergh is portrayed quite the opposite. She truly is friendly with Bengelsdorf. She truly relies upon him. She has an emotional connection to Bengelsdorf.
Which is kind of why he becomes the Rasputin at the end.
That's why he's Rasputin. That's
yeah.
exactly it.
Yeah, and in the scene that you alluded to earlier, Jack, at the White House, I can't remember if this is the novel, but in the series, Lindbergh snubs Bengelsdorf at the White House, but
Yes.
Anne Morrow Lindbergh embraces him, right? So,
film,
you know.
for sure, yeah.
Yeah,
Film,
it's-
very well done. Yeah.
I hate to wrap this up, but I want to tell everybody before they leave, we have a number. The Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida has a number of wonderful events coming up this fall. Go to our webpage, jst.ufl.edu. That's jst.ufl.edu. We have a terrific event next week with Nancy Sinkhoff. We'll be talking with her about Lucy Davidovich, the famous Holocaust historian, and her move to the political right and neoconservatism in the 1970s and 80s. We'll have an election panel in October, and we'll have a number of things after that. Also, please check out our Facebook page. This particular discussion, which was wonderful, has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel as well. So please stay in touch with us. We have your email addresses, so we'll be staying in touch with you. But thank you so much for coming. This was a terrific group, and I think a wonderful event. I'd like to thank the panelists again, Jack Kugelmas, Brett Ashley Kaplan, Gabriel Rosenfeld, and Rachel Gordon, for a wonderful discussion. If you have not read the book, The Plot Against America, it is certainly worth a read. And if you have not seen the series, particularly in Our Own Days, it is almost a must. Oh, it's not almost. It's a must watch. And for the students out there, I know that you don't have to have HBO to watch it. You find ways to watch these things that I can't figure out anyway. So please do, and please vote. I'd like the panel. Could the panel stick around for a few minutes? Everyone else, thank you so much for coming. And good night, and we hope to see you again next week and in the weeks to follow. Good luck to you.
Thank you all.